Hey, what's going on there, guys? Jack here from Integrity, and in this video we're going to be converting this picture by Wade Lambert of this classic vintage 1964 Dodge 330 Max Wedge into this fluid animation where the background and the road are moving. Very nice. With this animation, there will be two main difficulties. First, we'll be assembling our clean plate within Photoshop, whilst the second will be creating this kind of animation going off into the vanishing point within the background. And the difficulty will just be making it as seamless as possible. So without any further explanation, let's get into the tutorial by jumping into Photoshop, where the picture is of course already inside our project. Now, as said beforehand, it's going to take some time to assemble our clean plate with this Mirage animation, especially to get it done right, so bear with this stage and take your time. The first step, of course, is to create a duplicate of this background layer here, and we can do that by either moving it to the new layer button or by holding Control on the keyboard and hitting J. The next step is using the quick selection tool just up here to the top left, and then we'll just be creating a basic selection of the car. We don't need to be too precise here, but we will want to have not only the car within this selection, but also a little bit of the ground too, just where the shadow is. Alright, there we go. Pretty much all good from there. The next step is to finite this selection, and we'll be using the more advanced tools within Photoshop to achieve this. So let's just click on this select and mask button up here. Once done, you'll see a few new tools available. By the way, before going any further, you may see a different view to what we do, and that's because we have our view set to overlay. If you're an advanced user, pick whatever works for you. However, if you're new and wondering why you're seeing something different, just change the view to overlay. Right, let's just first magnify into what we're selecting at the moment. Okay, we can see a couple of imperfections here, so let's get to fixing those up. First, we'll want to select the brush tool up here to the left. We won't use the refine edge brush tool just yet, as the car is a fairly rigid structure and there's really no need. What we'll then do is just continue on with the selection process, basically just dotting the I's, crossing the T's sort of thing on what that quick selection tool has already picked up. So all in all, not too bad, but it does need some perfecting. So what we're doing essentially is just finiting the edges of the Dodge Max Wedge here, as some of these areas could be better, and obviously, we want this selection to be as perfect as possible, which, in this example, shouldn't really take too much time. However, when getting to the underneath of the car here, where the shadow is, it's a slightly different story, as the edges aren't exactly defined here. Really, we just want the darkest edges of the shadow of the car within the selection. So what we'll do first is just swap out for the refine edge brush. Then we'll just increase the diameter and just roll over the edges of where the darkest selection begins. Now for the front of the car, we'll just extend the selection here too, just underneath the bonnet of the car body, and just again get those harsher shadows on the road within our selection here. If we spot something like the tyre here, which is being slightly cut out of our selection, what we can do is just bring up the harshness of the brush tool quickly and just look at doing some very fine tweaks here just to get this in line to what we expect. This looks fairly decent, and when complete, what we want to do is change the output here from selection to new layer with layer mask, and then just down here we're good to hit OK. Once that's done, just up here you'll see a new layer within our project called Layer 1 Copy, accompanied by a mask. If you've done that, then we're on the right track here. Right, so next what we're going to be doing is just using Content Aware to fill in where the car is situated. And in order to do that, what we need to do is just bring back our selection. So we'll hold Control on the keyboard and then click on the mask here. We'll then select the I button just over here, which will disable that layer's visibility. And finally, we'll just enable the layer below and then select it within the layers panel just over here. We'll next go up here to select and then go to modify and finally expand. We'll then expand the selection to around 20 pixels, which will in turn give Content Aware just a little bit of breathing space. The next step after completing this, ensuring that you're still on the selection tool here, is just right-clicking on that selection here and then hitting fill. When you see this menu appear, what you want to do is ensure that it's set to content aware here and then hit OK. The results aren't that fantastic, but it's not exactly unusable, but we'll definitely need to perfect this, of course. Now, this is probably the trickiest part of this whole entire animation process. The first step to doing so is just using the clone stamp tool here, and we'll extend the brush size and then lower down the flow here to something like 13, which is good for stuff that has a lot of motion blur on it, like the background, say for example. Now within this section, what we're going to be doing is replicating this edge of the road here, and we can do that by just using the sample area here, basically just by holding Alt and then selecting a part of the image and then just painting over this selection. And what we're doing here is basically just transplanting parts of the image. As said before, we just want a light brush here. To create the edge of the road, however, we're going to need to be a little bit more precise and basically just replicate the edges. Now, in order to achieve this, what we're going to need to do is just go over to the lasso tool over here and then swap it out for the polygonal lasso tool. And what we want to do here is just choose a point midway from the horizon, from that vanishing point, and then draw a line out to the edge of the image and then just basically box in the whole background here. That will create this selection here, which we can use to transplant the good areas to replace the distorted areas. However, before getting to that, we'll need to feather out the selection, as we don't really want to leave any obvious harsh lines when doing this. So we'll just go over to the select here and then go to modify here and then finally hit feather. We won't need too much, so we'll change the radius from 20 to 5. Next, we'll go over to the clone stamp tool and then bring up the diameter, and all we're going to do is paint in those details that existed behind the car so it doesn't look so distorted. Now, after we've completed that, we should end up with a result like this, which for all intensive purposes is pretty decent. Now, that's the background, this trees area more or less complete here, so let's get to ironing out the distortions along the road. First, what we'll need to do is just go over to the polygonal lasso tool here and then create a selection around the road right next to the edges that we made just a moment ago. Then, much like last time, we'll feather out these edges here again, setting the feather radius to around about 5, and lastly we'll select the clone stamp tool here once again. Now we'll use the area to the top of the road here to transplant that data to the distorted result from content aware. Just really want to make it look like the edge of the road here essentially. As you can see, we've done a pretty good job here, so let's get to fixing the mass of the distortion here that sits on the actual road. Now we could attempt to use the spot healing brush and let's see what the results give us, ensuring that we also lose the selection as well while we're at it. To do so, we'll of course just brush over the whole distortion here, and when we release, it's not exactly great. So in this situation, spot healing brush is kind of out of the picture, unfortunately. However, what we can do is swap out from the spot healing brush into a different tool. So let's undo what we just did, and instead of spot healing, we'll use the healing brush instead, which should really do the trick. First, we'll need to hold Alt on the keyboard to bring up the sampling area and then use the top of the road here, and what we'll do is just paint back in some of this line here and then paint over some of this main distortion on the road. What we can then do is just go back over to the healing brush over here and swap it out for the patch tool and just get rid of some of these central distortions here where the lines are kind of evident. Right, let's see if there's anything else like jagged edges left from that brush that we were using earlier, and we can do so by just disabling and enabling this layer 1 copy. Well, there's this area behind the wheel here, so let's just get to using the patch tool here to remove this little area that looks fairly fake. Next step, we'll need to recreate that line in the road here, and we could probably do so by using the clone stamp tool. We'll still keep it to 13% here in terms of flow, but we'll also bring down the harshness of the brush to something a lot more softer, and then just paint in those lines, either using the area in the background or the foreground. We'll also just paint over some of these areas which don't look so good and just make them seem more like part of the overall image. Like the light over the road here, that should probably extend outwards here, and just clean this road out just a tad bit too. Finally, we'll need to emphasize those shadow details here. So let's use the burn tool here to the side and start with that. Before using the tool, however, just make sure that the range is set to shadows before doing this. We'll first expand the brush, then enable the layer 1 copy, but we'll still keep the clean plate selected when using this as a reference, and then just bring down the levels in this area where the car sits on top. We just want to add to that shadow here after all. Now, after doing so, what you can see is that there's more of a difference between the car and the road in terms of the shadow. So let's just bring down the levels under the car here by selecting that layer 1 copy and then just bringing the diameter down and just again brushing over those lighter areas to make everything just match up a little bit better. We'll enable and disable the layer, correcting anything that looks slightly off, and then select the clean plate again and darken some of the areas where the car would sit on top of. There we go. If we disable and enable the layer, it's looking pretty good so far. It's probably now ready for use in Mirage. So that's more or less the most complicated part of this projection over and done with. Right, so before saving, let's just rename some of these layers. This layer 1, of course, we'll call clean plate, and then this layer copy will be named, well, just layer 1. Finally, let's just get to saving this project, and in our case, we'll just place it on the desktop to save some time later on down the road when we get to importing in this project into After Effects. Cool, and as said before, that's probably the trickiest part over and done with. Now let's just get into the Photomotion part of the tutorial by first double-clicking on this Photomotion X folder in order to get access to all these different projections. Now in this example, we want access to this Photomotion Mirage folder, as that contains the project called Mirage. Of course, to use Photomotion, no external application is required. All you need to do is just double click on the project file and boot up After Effects. Now, when Mirage boots up, you'll see this Start Mirage button in the viewport, which we'll of course just double click on. Okay, now we're in the main dashboard. However, all the buttons here are blank, as you can see. So, of course, the only option that we have at this stage is to double click on this Add Photo button, which will bring us into this blank composition. If you're seeing this, then you're in the right place. The next step is to import in our Photoshop project by either using the import command or by dragging and dropping it into the project panel from wherever we saved it in. In our use case, that's of course the desktop. Now when we do so, this little menu here will appear, and really the only thing that we want to make sure is that this import kind is set to composition, as we want access to each Photoshop layer independently. After that's finished, you'll see this new bin appear within the project panel within this After Effects project, and if we were to expand it, you can see that it houses all of our layers. Okay, so in this composition, we're going to need to bring in our clean plate layer, so let's do that now by just dragging it into our composition panel here and then parenting it to the parent settings layer up here by using the pick, whip, swirl icon, whilst of course holding shift. That way our scale remains consistent when we get to adding in that car. The next step of course is to scale it. It fits the composition window here a lot more better. You can see here it fits our viewport now rather quite nicely. Cool, so with that done, let's get back to the main dashboard and get into setting up our animation. The first step to setting up our animation within Mirage, of course, is to set our mask up and basically just tell Photomotion Mirage what we want animated within our image. So let's just double click on this set mask button down here. We'll then click on this draw mask button over here to get access into this composition. Now this part is fairly simple. In this area, what we'll want to do is just set up a mask. So first, let's select this composition layer down here in the composition window and then go up here to the pen tool and of course select it. Now we'll be working with this example a little bit differently in contrast to other projections assembled with Mirage, as here we want the whole entire background to move, not like a certain park, aka a lake or clouds. So we'll apply a mask to the whole of the image here, to the whole of the viewport, and then swap out out the pen tool for the selection tool as we want to get back into the main dashboard here, and when back, we obviously don't want to mask out any of our buttons. When back, this is the part where we'll get into animating what we have so far. Okay, so to animate this image, the first step, of course, is to select this animate button down here. When in here, what we'll need to do is just select this layer over here and ensure that our playhead is at the very beginning of the composition. That's quite important. The next stage is to go up here just to the top and swap out the selection tool here for the puppet tool. Again, make sure that the playhead is at the very beginning of the composition before getting on with this section. And what we'll be doing is just creating a series of points around the perimeter of the image here. We'll want quite a lot as we're moving some points. We'll want to keep certain parts of this animation pinned in place. So say, for example, the bottom of the road. Next, after creating this perimeter of pinpoints, using the puppet tool, of course, we'll then get to placing a few points within the center of the image as we want to create a movement along the middle of this image too. And basically what we're going to be doing is just pushing the majority of this image further down towards the vanishing point, and then swap out the pen tool for the selection tool. Now the next step after assembling our points is moving our playhead. Within this example, we'll be moving our playhead to around the 90 frames point here. Keep a note of that 90 frames point as we will need that information later. Now, if you're seeing seconds instead of frames, by the way, you can hold Control here and then click on the time code, which will change it over to frame count. So with our playhead still on the 90 frames point, let's just move this move me to desired loop time marker that you can see. You can also hold Shift, by the way, which will snap that marker to the playhead when it gets close, of course. Next, let's just go over to Effect Controls here and see what we can do. Well, within Effect Controls, you can see this puppet effect here, which, if we click on it, will show all of these puppet points again. All we're going to do is just start moving a load of these to the left, of course, just clicking and dragging them along. We don't need something too exaggerated, as we don't want too many distortions, but we will want it to seem like this image is moving in a particular direction, along where we'd imagine the vanishing point would be within the center of the road here. Now, keep in mind, we'll also want to leave the points at the very bottom here, as we don't want to be tweaking those edges in this example. But the ones at the top here and to the right, we're of course going to be moving. It doesn't matter, by the way, if we're seeing anything weird to the sides and to the top behind basically this composition layer, as we'll fix that problem in a second. Okay, so once done, we should end up with something like this, which is pretty good. Again, the bottom here is completely still, none of those puppet points are moving, and therefore we're not going to be seeing anything too distracting. Now, of course, to the next step. Let's mark out our working path here, and maybe let's do a few adjustments. To get this right, we might need to go back and adjust a few points here a multitude of times, by the way, and just because we're provisionally finished with this part doesn't mean it's inherently perfect just yet. However, we'll need to assemble the animation first to get our bearings on how good this looks overall. So let's just get to fixing these weird edges here to the right by adding some scale, although we're not going to be doing that by the base layer attributes. First, we'll go over to the Effects and Presets panel here, and what we'll do is type out transform in the search bar here. Now, with this layer selected, we'll double click on the transforming effect here in order to apply it. In Effect Controls now, you'll see all of these different parameters under transform. We'll only be interested in that scale one within this example, so don't focus on any of the others. So let's just bring the scale here to something like 110, where we're not seeing any of those distortions over the perimeter of the viewport. Now let's just double check how it looks with our playhead at the beginning of the composition, and then go into the main dashboard. Right, so before doing anything else, like previewing the animation for example, we'll need to bring that car in. So let's just double click on this layer 1 button over here, and then in this composition, we'll just double click on this import mask, which will bring us into this composition. Now within this blank composition, similar to what we did when we imported in our clean plate, we'll want to navigate over to the project panel here, find that car layer that we separated out in Photoshop, aka this layer 1, and drag it and drop it into the composition. We'll then parent it to the parent settings layer whilst holding shift, which will scale it proportionately to the clean plate layer that we sorted out earlier. However, those attributes don't take into account the extra scale that we used with the transform effect earlier. So with the base Photoshop layer selected in the composition, we'll need to go over to the effects and presets panel again and apply that transform effect onto that layer. And finally, of course, just bump the scale to 110 as to match the amount that we applied within that animate composition earlier. And there we go, this car's scale should match the image now without seeming funky. And now that we're done with that, let's just swap out to the main dashboard and see what's up. Now, let's get to previewing what we have here. Well, it's looking okay, but we can definitely spot some imperfections here in regards to the animation. The obvious one, of course, would be the crossfade here, but if you look really carefully, the way that these trees are animating as well as the road, it doesn't seem quite like they're rolling off into the vanishing point, but rather are a little bit too stationary, or the direction that they're traveling is slightly off. So let's just get to fixing that now by jumping back into the animate composition once again, bringing our playhead to the very end of the composition here, and then going into effect controls and selecting this puppet tab to bring back the puppet points. We'll next just adjust them. So again, fixing the movement of that tree and the direction that some of these puppet points are animating to, so it looks a little bit more immersive. Now back in the main dashboard, let's fix that crossfade by clicking on the animation button on the dashboard and then navigating over to effect controls. We'll want to bring up this loop fade length up to the exact point that our animation ends. Now remember that 90 frame point that we highlighted earlier when we were just creating those puppet points? Well, that's where we'll be bringing our loop fade length in this example. So again, the full duration of this animation. Now back to the main dashboard and let's see what we have here after we've done so. It's looking okay, but if you look to the viewport, very carefully look within those trees to the right, you'll see a small segment that isn't moving in the same way as everything else. Now, of course, within this class in particular, when previewing this animation, make sure to look at it repeatedly, as errors like this might be very difficult to spot. So let's go back to the animate composition again, move our playhead to the end, and just move that point here in order to make sure not to have this distortion show within the final result. Okay, so that's the second most difficult part of the animation over and done with. In the next stage, we'll just get to accessing the export composition and just add a final few touches. However, before getting access to that composition, let's ensure that we change the export resolution, as we want to be exporting out at 4K and by default it will be 1080p. So to do so, we just need to click on the resolution button up here to the right, which will show us these options in effect controls. Now next to the resolution, it will say 1080p of course, so let's just select that, and from this drop down we'll hit this 4K instead. With that done, let's just access the export composition. Now in this composition you'll notice a series of numbers at the bottom, and that is the Photomotion Perfect Cut system, and that basically tells us whereabouts our end of work path needs to be in order to achieve a specific number of loops within our animation. Now in this example we want 3 loops, so we'll want to bring our playhead to the 3 loops point by going over to the frame count indicator here and then typing out 135 frames, as that's what Photomotion tells us is 3 loops. Now, when our playhead moves, you'll see that Photomotion Perfect Cut has changed from highlighting that 90 to 135 instead, which means we're good to go, of course, for 3 loops. The final step, of course, is to mark the end of our working area, as without which, when we get to rendering, we'll send the whole of this composition to After Effects render engine, which, you know, of course we don't exactly want. Okay, so with that done, let's get to adding a few extra elements to this animation. To do so, first, we'll just go over to the bottom right of the viewport and double click on this blue effects button here, which will show us a new menu. In here, we have a variety of different effects which we could use. In this example though, we just want to overlay in some particles on top, so let's just double click on the particles button over here, and when inside this area, we'll just hit space to preview, which will play all of these previews that you can see in a viewport. Now, we want something with direction to it, but not overly cluttered either, just a very subtle effect, so let's choose these ones 2 rows down. To choose these ones, we'll just need to stop the preview and then select it on the viewport. The next stage is just holding Control and then hitting C. Next, let's just go back to that 4K render composition, our export composition, and with this composition panel selected, hold Control and then hit V in order to paste it into the composition. Now, before settling for this, what we'll want to do first is just drag it down below this composition settings layer here, and when we've done so, we'll just drag this fade out marker here to the end of our working area. Well, playhead is. Now remember, if you hold shift whilst doing so, that will snap that marker to that position when it gets close. Now, if you're finding some slowdown with your playhead and the reaction of that playhead moving in the viewport, what you can do here is just change the preview resolution here to half, which will play whatever's in the composition to half the amount of the resolution. Once done, let's just preview what we have here. It's okay, but we'll need to change the directions of these particles here, as currently they're going in the opposite way to how they would be going in reality. So let's just go over to Effect Controls here, and then under Reverse Left Right Setting, let's just check that, which will reverse the flow of the particle overlay here, and then we'll just check this reverse up down too, and when we preview, we can see that these particles move in a direction that's a lot more immersive to what we expect them to do in real life. It's really good so far, although there are 1 or 2 things that we can do to really hone in this animation before exporting. First, we'll go down to the composition panel, right click on it, and then select New and then Adjustment Layer. Then we'll drag this adjustment layer below the settings layer and this particles layer that you can see here. So what we want to do here is apply a blur to basically the back of the car and the background to give the impression of some directional blur. What we'll do is, with the adjustment layer selected, we'll just go over to Effects and Presets here and then type out Fast Box Blur here, and again with the adjustment layer selected, we'll just double click on it in order to apply it. We'll then go over to Effect Controls here and then ramp up the blur's radius here, and finally check this Repeat Edge Pixels. Lastly, we'll want to change the blur dimensions from horizontal and vertical to just horizontal. As you can see, the blur looks a little bit more directional from what it did earlier beforehand. Now on to the next step. Again, with the adjustment layer selected, we're going to select the pen tool up here and then mask out some of this blur, as we don't want it applied to the whole entire animation, of course. What we'll want to mask here is just in between this car here and some of the road and towards the would-be vanishing point. Now here, we're going to need to add some feather, otherwise we'll clearly see the mask lines. So with the adjustment layer selected, we'll hit F on the keyboard to bring up the feathering attributes and ramp them up to something extreme like 463 odd, and as you can see, we have this really nice subtle directional blur, and you can't really see where the blur ends or begins. It's very immersive, although let's just tweak a few of these mask points before we sign off on it. Very cool. Let's just rename the adjustment layer as not to confuse us in the next stage. Now, final step before exporting, let's just add in those beams of light that you can see in the final animation. First, we'll just create another adjustment layer here, then we'll just go over to Effects and Presets here and type out in the search light rays. So we'll apply this effect, and within the Effects Controls panel, we can see all of these settings here in case we need to change something. However, we'll just need to change the actual position where those light rays exist. We can do so in 2 different ways, by the way. We can either change the position within Effect Controls, or if you look very carefully on the viewport, you can see this tiny target icon here, which basically controls the whereabouts where these light rays are generated from. Now, in this example, we want this light ray generator to sit on top of this area where this car sits. As it stands, it's a little bit too subtle and small here, so we'll want to bring out the radius in effect controls so that will make the light rays larger. When done, we just want to tweak its position just a tad more, and there we are. That's this animation complete. Now let's just have a quick preview. Very nice. And those light rays, whilst in reality within this project sit on top of our animation, actually it has the illusion of almost seeming like it's behind those trees, like there's a sun there that's beaming out light. So that's really cool and immersive. Now, of course, before moving on, let's just rename this adjustment layer down here. Okay, so with that done, that's the animation complete, and we can finally get to rendering. Let's just go up here to the composition tab and then select this add to render queue, which will bring the working area within this composition into the After Effects render engine. Now, the next step is just changing the export format, and we can do that by just going over here and clicking on this lossless, which will open this output menu. We'll want to swap out the format here from AVI to QuickTime. The next step is just making sure that the output location is fine, and lastly, we'll just hit this render button over here to finish the process. Now, the problem is, if we start to think about uploading to social media, that's going to be a slight problem here. That's because the end export will be a .mov, and we want that to be an MP4. So let's just boot up Media Encoder to re-render this .mov file as a H.264 file, aka an MP4, which of course is far better for sites like Instagram. Once we're happy with the format and the output location, nothing really left to do bar just hit the render button, and there we go. That's this animation concluded, and we have this really cool fluid animation of this classic vintage 1964 Dodge. Don't forget, if you're interested, we have plenty of other classes on different projections, so of course feel free to check those out.